Okay, so let's talk about studying military history. Let's consider a few things, sort of by way of building up to the reading, but also just some general considerations that you probably want to keep in mind if you're going to start studying the topic in any sort of orderly academic manner. So, the reading for this week is Cathal Nolan's introduction to his book, The Allure of Battle. And actually, to be honest, that was not my first choice for a reading. The first choice that I would have given you was probably something from, where is it? Probably Rupert Smith's Utility of Force, which is not a bad study by a very prominent, now retired, I think he's now retired, British general. Or I would have given you something from Soldiers and Civilization. Probably not War. What is it good for? Ian Morris writes. He's a political scientist. He writes some very interesting things. But that would also be a possibility. No, he's a history. His classics in history. Sorry, not a political scientist. But he's done a lot of political science, sort of historically informed geopolitical philosophy type books, I suppose you could say. I would have assigned you something along those lines, perhaps some opening ruminations from John Lynn. This is an old classic as well. Battle, a history of combat and culture, which takes a very different line from Nolan's book. Nolan is basically writing an entire book trying to tell you that this obsession with battles, which is this kind of, he says, is a very sort of a modern phenomenon, and he's mostly dealing with the United States, although the phenomenon is not limited to the United States, that it really gets in the way of our understanding war in general, and that has very negative impacts on American foreign policy, because domestically we understand war as being tied up with decisive battles. I could have given you a couple other articles. In fact, I will be posting these up, well, a couple from this particular author, and I don't have his book, his main book here right now. And that's Tonio Andrade, who teaches at Emory, who has written on the concept of decisive battles in world history. And he's also written really, really good stuff about how to construct effective models of global military history, particularly in the late medieval and early modern periods, so that we're not just simply doing the military revolution in which Europe has a military revolution and nowhere else does. It's been a very useful concept, a very fruitful concept. It's really stirred a lot of thought, but we'll get to that in a few weeks. The key readings on that, at least up to early 2000s, I guess, would be the Military Revolution Debate, edited by Cliff Rogers at the United States Military Academy. And of course, there's all kinds of writings about strategy. How do we try to, we as in policymakers, heads of state, and so on, heads of military and so on, try to use military force in a way that carries out the dictates of policy, hopefully civilian government-made policy, but in general the coordination of military efforts to achieve the desired political effect or result. I could have given you any one of these. Unfortunately, I ran into a bit of a problem in that the department printer was down precisely when I needed to upload them. So I gave you Cathal Nolan's instead. But by way of setting that up and also helping to inform our discussion of military history in the next 15 weeks, I'd like to go over a few things about what we do as historians, and particularly what military historians do. Okay, that was by way of build-up. I refer you, first of all, to a fantastic article from 1962. It's actually a speech given in 1961 by a very young Michael Howard, Sir Michael Howard, who passed away a couple years ago now, one of the great British military historians, and it's called The Use and Abuse of Military History. You can find it in your Week 1 introduction folder on perusal. Howard talks about the need to study military history in 3 dimensions: depth, width, or what we in the U.S. might call breadth, and context. So width or breadth, you need to understand development over time. Depth, you should take specific campaigns, specific wars, specific battles, and really dive into them in great detail. And then in context, you have to understand society. So long before there was this division in military history between the so-called old military history, which was all battles, or they often derisively called drums and trumpets military history, and the new military history, which was social and cultural, and which then tends to look down on anything studying actual military campaigning, or would rather say, look, these wars are always produced by a society. It's more important to understand the social and cultural aspects of that society than it is to understand necessarily how it was fought. Long before that division, which is kind of done now, more or less. I mean, the new military history is now old. Howard is saying, well, you have to understand society. This is in the early 60s. He's saying, look, wars are produced by societies. They are fought in societies. You have to understand society. So to study military history effectively, you have to understand how wars actually happen. You have to understand development or change over time. And you have to understand the context, the societal, cultural, economic, insert whatever other subfield of history in there in order to understand how they happen to take place. So depth, width, and context. There are a few other challenges involved in studying military history that Howard goes on to discuss. One is the divide between academics and practicing military practitioners. And that comes with disadvantages to both. On the one hand, if you've not been an actual practitioner of military affairs, you may start describing something or constructing some picture which is just technically or physically impossible. So you'll find that military historians tend to be extremely geeky, especially people like me who are into sort of medieval warfare, but also even the modern modern combat, World War II, Napoleonic Wars, American Civil War in particular. You'll find that we get very geeky about this stuff. We need to know how the rifled musket is manufactured. We need to know what it can do. Ideally, we would have working replicas. We go test them. Sometimes this is called living archaeology. It's called experimental archaeology. If you're a medieval military historian and you were in that select group some years back, invited to Denmark to go experiment with medieval gunpowder recipes, you'd be having the time of your life. But we tend to be very conscious of that because we don't want to go making broad statements born out of an ignorance of the actual practical realities of the situation. The problem for military practitioners is that there's a strong tendency to read modern conditions and understanding back onto anything that's, Napoleonic and earlier, and think that they're doing the same thing or understanding what they're doing the same way as we do today. It's quite possible to take that too far. In fact, I have friends and colleagues who I think do take that too far. Oh, no. They weren't trying to turn a flank in 1356 because we have to understand the cultural reality. It's like, well, okay, but there's also, if you go to the ground and you read the terrain, say at Poitiers, what's the reason for doing that? It's not simply chivalry and proving your bravery and valor. So we have these arguments. But on the other hand, if you start talking about military maneuvers as if there was some idea of, let's say, something which is very popular in the U.S. military right now, like mission command. Did they have that back in the medieval and ancient periods? It's a good question. I think there was some version of it. What about strategy? If you read medieval military manuals, they don't talk about strategy, but they obviously had it. I mean, the Byzantines do a bit. Clearly, they have an idea of political objectives and the use of military force to achieve political objectives, but they don't use the word. So in pre-modern situations particularly, we're stuck with identifying something which matches what we do today, but they're not using the same word for it. And now from that, of course, we can have basically endless arguments. So from Howard's article, we have depth, width, and context. We have the dangers besetting both academics and military practitioners in studying military history. And then the third issue is the issue of sources. And evidence. And we have the issue of how we do history. There is the question of the historian's own role in creating a narrative. Every historian who writes an account of something is choosing evidence, is organizing that evidence, is framing that evidence, and is interpreting that evidence. You try to be objective. The old adage is that the historian's job is just to be objective. That's it. Well, it's not possible to achieve objectivity. You are a product of your time, your upbringing, or your experiences. I'm kind of old-fashioned in the sense that while we acknowledge that, we also acknowledge points against our own interpretations. We acknowledge when things are not as we would like them to be, where the evidence doesn't actually show what we would like it to show. And this was argued back in the 80s, early 90s, where this really came to a head. There was a huge book called That Noble Dream, Objectivity in the American Historical Profession by Peter Novick. And the response, to my mind, the best response to that book, which you should, unless you're going to grad school for history, you should not read this book. It is like over 600 pages, and it's rather dry. But the best response to this was probably Thomas Haskell, late Thomas Haskell, who taught at Rice University for a long time, called Objectivity is Not Neutrality, in which he said, look, we have to act in a way that, such a way that objectivity, as if we believe objectivity is possible. Even though we acknowledge that we're probably going to fall short. We will fall short in some ways. So that's kind of the third wrinkle to studying military history, is that we are choosing, organizing, and interpreting the facts that we're going to use. The great book, one of the best introductions to history that I think is out there, Landscape of History. And I just completely blanked on who wrote that, although I've had to read it multiple times. It points out that we're not creating a one-for-one version of what happened in the past. If that was true, we would have to write something that took into account everything that happened every minute of the day. We're not doing that. So selection, condensation, condensing things down, that's inevitable. And then, of course, the last difficulty, and particularly so with military history, such that I like to say to people that, well, we military historians have been dealing with issues of evidence for a very long time. We've been very alive to these things, is that our evidence is often confused and contradictory. If you go into the National Archives in the United Kingdom and you order a book, maybe the War Diaries of the Guards Armored or the 11th Armored Divisions, which participated in the Normandy campaign in 1944, you will find nice, neat accounts of when they received messages, what orders were given, reports on state of ammunition, just any variety of things. And they'll have, WO/ whatever. I can't remember what the call number is. I I haven't looked at those documents in a while. War Office, which is where this is cataloged classified for the British. You might go down to the regimental level and you'll find that some things don't agree. Or you'll find that it was entered, the official war diary enters one thing, but multiple personal accounts written by soldiers in that division say something rather different. They give a different time. They give a different day. They give a different sequence of events. And if one person does that, but everyone else is agreed on the time and day and sequence, well, then that person might just not be remembering correctly. But what if you have multiple different accounts? And this is particularly the case for some of the British units in the Western Desert in 1941-42, you don't have the official records because they were lost because the Germans and Italians overran them. Well, now you have an interesting pickle. So we have confused and contradictory evidence. We have the issue of historians being very real agents in the writing of history. We have the difficulties both from a military practitioner and an academic side of things. And then you have the need beyond that, as Howard says, to study history in three contexts. Okay, and that's sort of, I think, a good introduction to studying this. And all this has to be done before we get to Nolan, in essence. So I gave you Nolan to read. If you read it or you're starting to read his account. And his argument is that battles are not really necessary. You have to go through all the different steps that I just outlined, as basically what Howard outlined, to be more accurate, before you can begin to really take on a major thesis of the sort that Nolan is putting forward. That's why his book is actually, The Allure of Battle is actually quite a big book, because he's trying to go through multiple campaigns to show battle is not that important. The overall conditions are, as Lee says in the opening of his book, Lee's looking at innovation. Nolan is looking at war-winning capacity, in essence. Battles do not produce that, according to Nolan. Lee's looking at innovation, but the same three areas apply: capacity, calculation, and culture. Those things are more important than individual battles. In modern warfare, Nolan's careful to qualify this to modern warfare. So, this is kind of our challenge. And I think next time I'll focus a little bit on some specific aspects of what the historian studies, somewhat separate from military history, but these are some initial thoughts for you to deal with on how you would go about studying war in history.